July 10, 1942. Akutan Island, Alaska Territory. The binoculars shook slightly in machinist mate Albert Knack's hands as he stared through the observation window of the PBY Catalina. His pulse quickened at the sight below, sitting abandoned in the marshy grass. There they were, the red circles painted on the wings. Those unmistakable rising sun emblems. Every American pilot knew what that meant. They were looking at a Japanese Zero fighter flipped upside down in the wet ground, and somehow, impossibly, it looked almost whole. Lieutenant William Tiers had been flying blind through the fog that wrapped around the Aleutian Islands like a thick blanket. Using dead reckoning to navigate, he'd managed to reorient over the Shoemargin Islands and chose what seemed like the most direct path back to Dutch Harbor, flying straight across Akutan Island. It was a route seldom traveled, a route that would reshape everything that followed in the Pacific War. Knack's mind raced. This couldn't be real. No Japanese pilot would abandon such a treasure. For more than a year, this aircraft had been the shadow haunting Pacific skies, the weapon everyone whispered about with dread. It had torn through American, British, and Chinese fighters with brutal efficiency, over Pearl Harbor, across the Philippines, throughout Burma and Malaya. The Zero had accomplished what seemed impossible, a carrier fighter that outfought land-based interceptors. As Thiers circled the wreckage 3 times, carefully marking its position on his chart, neither pilot understood the magnitude of what lay beneath them. They had stumbled upon something that American military historians would eventually recognize as invaluable. What they were about to recover would reveal the strangest contradiction in aircraft design philosophy of the entire Second World War. A contradiction written not in technical specifications, but in lives saved and battles won through a single extraordinary discovery. The Zero's fearsome reputation had grown from terror and admiration. Since Pearl Harbor 7 months earlier, American aviators had tangled with something that shattered their assumptions about Japanese industrial strength. It was fast, nimble, long-ranged. It ruled the Pacific skies with ruthless authority. Against older Soviet-built fighters in early China operations, Zeros achieved kill ratios reaching 12-1. April 1942 brought another shock. A Japanese strike force carrying 36 Zeros attacked the airfield, destroying 27 British aircraft while losing just 5 of their own. The official American tactic when confronting a Zero was simple and humbling. Escape, break contact, never attempt to dogfight. These weren't cowardly orders, they came from harsh reality. American pilots who tried to match a Zero in a turning fight died. Pilots who attempted conventional aerial tactics against this nimble opponent seldom survived to describe what went wrong. June 4, 1942. That same day as the pivotal Battle of Midway, but 1,500 miles to the south. As part of Japan's elaborate strategy to capture Midway itself, a diversionary strike force assaulted the Aleutian Islands to pull American attention northward. 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga launched from the Japanese carrier Ryujo, leading the second wave against Dutch Harbor. His Zero, serial number 4593, flew with 2 wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsugo Shikada, assigned to strafe the American naval installation on Unalaska Island. The 3 aircraft dove hard on the harbor, their guns blazing. They shot down an American PBY Catalina and raked survivors thrashing in the water with machine gun fire. Then something struck Koga's aircraft. Ground fire. A single bullet severed the oil line, not immediately catastrophic, but deadly within minutes as engine oil sprayed across the cold Alaskan sky. 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor sat Akutan Island, designated by Japanese planners as an emergency landing strip. A Japanese submarine waited offshore, ready to pluck downed pilots from the water. As his oil pressure gauge plummeted, Koga signaled his wingman and turned toward Akutan. From altitude, the grassy expanse seemed perfect. Flat, solid, welcoming, safe. Half a mile inland from the rocky shore, the field appeared inviting. Shikada, circling above, suddenly caught the glint of water between the grass blades. His stomach twisted. The ground wasn't firm at all, it was swamp. He desperately tried signaling Koga to bellyland, But Koga had already committed. The landing gear descended. The Zero's wheels touched grass and immediately sank into soft mud beneath. The aircraft pitched forward with terrible violence, flipping end over end. When it stopped moving, it rested upside down, its wings and fuselage largely intact. Inside the inverted cockpit, Tadayoshi Koga's life ended instantly. The impact snapped his neck. Endo and Shikada circled the wreckage overhead, their minds torn between duty and compassion. Japanese pilots received strict orders about downed aircraft in enemy territory. Destroy them. The aircraft's secrets were too precious, its capabilities too critical to risk capture. But Koga might survive. They couldn't bring themselves to strafe their friend. After circling several times, their fuel running low and weather deteriorating, they turned west toward their carrier. They believed a submarine would retrieve Koga and the aircraft soon. The submarine searched for hours but got chased away by the USS Williamson, an American destroyer on patrol. Koga remained in the cockpit. The Zero lay undisturbed in the marsh, invisible from routine flight paths, unknown to anyone American. 30 days passed. Fog and rain hid the prize. Then Albert Nack spotted something through a gap in the clouds that looked like a small aircraft. On July 11th, Lieutenant Thier returned with a recovery party. They moved toward the overturned Zero cautiously, weapons drawn, uncertain what awaited them. Chief Aviation Pilot William Scarborough, a seasoned naval aviator assigned to the recovery team, waded through the marsh to reach the aircraft. He leaned into the cockpit and found Koga's body, still strapped into the pilot's seat. The recovery team stood silently, studying the machine that had terrorized American aviators across the Pacific. Even upside down and damaged, the Zero radiated predatory grace, sleek lines, minimal projections, a design that whispered of speed and agility. They documented the wreckage from every angle, photographing it carefully before attempting recovery. Koga was removed from the cockpit and given a Christian burial nearby. Regardless of national conflict, this pilot deserved respect as a warrior. Then the serious work commenced. The team examined the Zero's structure meticulously, noting every detail. What they discovered in those opening hours would prove as vital as the test flights to follow. The aircraft struck them as remarkably light. Not just overall weight, but every single component. The skin felt thin beneath their fingers, almost delicate. Scarborough tapped the fuselage and heard a hollow sound, like a tin can, not a fighting aircraft. He searched for armor plating around the cockpit. He found nothing. He looked for armored glass in the windscreen. He found ordinary clear panels. He examined the fuel tanks and discovered simple aluminum containers with no self-sealing capability. This was fundamentally wrong. It contradicted everything American aircraft designers believed about fighter construction. Modern warplanes were increasingly built with protective measures. Steel armor behind the pilot, armored windscreen glass, self-sealing fuel tanks containing rubber bladders that puffed shut when punctured. These features added weight but preserved pilot lives. The Zero had none. 3 separate recovery operations were required. The Aleutian weather, infamous for violent storms and thick fog, blocked initial attempts. On July 12th, a recovery team led by Lieutenant Robert Kerms gave Koga a proper Christian burial, replacing the hastily dug grave from the previous day. They tried recovering the aircraft, but the support ship lost its anchors in rough seas. Finally, on July 15th, a barge reached the site. Workers built a makeshift sledge and dragged the Zero through marsh to the beach. Even waterlogged and battered, the aircraft weighed surprisingly little. 6 men could move it. The Zero got loaded aboard the USS St. Mihiel and transported to Seattle, arriving August 1st. From Seattle, it traveled by barge to Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego. The journey consumed most of a month. During transit, American intelligence specialists examined photographs, debating what they'd actually secured. At North Island, the Zero sat under constant military police watch, not just against sabotage, though that worried them, but against souvenir seekers who wanted pieces of the legendary fighter. Every mechanic, every pilot, every engineer craved a fragment. Guards received orders to shoot anyone attempting unauthorized contact. Navy technicians began painstaking restoration work. Experienced mechanics approached the Zero with professional curiosity mixed with skepticism. Japanese aircraft were supposed to be crude copies of Western designs, built with inferior materials and careless workmanship. Propaganda had primed them to find a cheap imitation. What they discovered instead left them speechless. The Zero represented masterful engineering dedicated to weight reduction. Every component bore signs of obsessive attention to minimizing mass. Main wing spars used extra super duralumin, a lightweight aluminum alloy developed by Sumitomo Metal Industries in 1936. This alloy combined zinc with aluminum to produce material that was lighter and stronger than standard aircraft aluminum, though it corroded easily. The Japanese had understood this weakness and applied a zinc chromate coating after fabrication. It was sophisticated metallurgy, matching or exceeding American capabilities of that era. Structural details showed ingenious mass-saving solutions. Wing attachment fittings were reduced by bonding wings permanently to the fuselage, eliminating heavy removable joints. The rear fuselage detached behind the cockpit for service work while keeping forward structures light. Engine positioning near the wing's leading edge allowed a shorter, lighter tail section while preserving balance. Control surfaces used fabric covering, where American designs employed heavier metal. Landing gear struts were narrower than American equivalents. The cockpit framework was stripped down, offering outstanding pilot visibility, but zero protection. The repair team straightened the bent vertical stabilizer, rudder, wingtips, flaps, and canopy. The landing gear struts, sheared off during impact, needed complete replacement. The three-blade Sumitomo propeller got straightened and reused. Despite damage, it remained serviceable, evidence of Japanese manufacturing standards. As restoration continued, precise measurements revealed the A6M2 weighed just 5,155 pounds fully loaded. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, America's main carrier fighter, weighed 7,426 pounds. The Zero was nearly 1,900 pounds lighter, close to 2,000 pounds difference. That weight advantage translated directly into performance capabilities. The Zero's Nakajima Sakae 14-cylinder radial engine produced 950 horsepower. The Wildcat's Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp generated 1,200 horsepower. The American fighter had 250 additional horsepower but carried 2,000 extra pounds. Power-to-weight ratio favored the Zero decisively. Wing loading painted the same picture. The Zero carried 24.3 pounds per square foot of wing area. The Wildcat carried 28.6 pounds per square foot. Lower wing loading meant the Zero could turn more sharply, climb quicker, and maneuver more aggressively. In a turning dogfight, physics gave the Zero an absolute advantage. But examining the fuel system revealed something deeply troubling. The fuel tanks were simple aluminum containers, thin-walled and unprotected. American aircraft utilized self-sealing tanks with multiple protective layers. An outer rubber layer, a middle layer of vulcanized fabric, an inner layer that expanded when punctured, sealing holes and blocking fuel leaks. Self-sealing tanks added considerable weight. They cost more. They reduced fuel capacity, but they saved lives. One bullet through a standard tank meant fire and death. One bullet through a self-sealing tank meant a small leak. Manageable, survivable. The Zero had sacrificed survival for performance. Every Japanese pilot knew this trade-off. A single bullet in the fuel system meant probable death. No leak, no gradual fuel loss, no possibility of nursing a damaged aircraft home. There would be fire, explosion, catastrophic flames. American pilots had reported Zeros igniting from minimal damage. Now the explanation stood clear. The absence of pilot armor shocked them equally. American fighters mounted thick steel plates behind the pilot's seat, adding protective weight to shield against enemy fire from behind, the most frequent attack angle. The Zero had nothing, just a thin metal frame with a fabric cushion. A .50 caliber bullet would pierce the seat, the pilot, with identical ease. The windscreen relied on standard glass, perhaps marginally thicker than what you'd find in civilian aircraft, but it provided virtually no protection against bullets. American fighters were increasingly outfitting their planes with armored glass. heavy, transparent panes capable of stopping small arms rounds. The Zero sacrificed this protection for the sake of weight savings, leaving its pilots dangerously exposed whenever they faced head-on attacks. By September 20th, 1942, 2 months after the crash at Akutan, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders was ready. He climbed into the cockpit of the repaired Zero for its maiden test flight. Sanders stood among the Navy's most seasoned test pilots, a man whose career was built on one fundamental skill: knowing exactly what an aircraft could and couldn't do, and understanding the difference between capability and catastrophe. He settled into the tight, cramped seat and immediately felt the difference from American designs. Everything was compact, efficient, almost claustrophobic. The engines fired up with impressive smoothness. Japanese engineering, whatever its failings in other areas, had produced dependable engines that delivered their power reliably. Sanders taxied forward carefully, acutely aware that the narrow landing gear made ground handling delicate and demanding. He pushed the throttles forward and sensed the aircraft gathering itself, eager to move. The takeoff roll was astonishingly brief. The Zero lifted skyward and climbed with a vigor that caught even an experienced test pilot off guard. Once at altitude, Sanders moved through his testing methodically. He began with the fundamentals: level flight, gentle turns, climbs and descents, basic handling characteristics. The controls responded immediately to the lightest touch. Small movements of the stick translated instantly into aircraft movement. After years in American fighters, this felt like trading a truck for a sports car. Responsive, nimble, almost alive beneath his hands. He pushed harder, testing the boundaries. Speed runs showed the Zero could achieve roughly 330 miles per hour, faster than the Wildcat certainly, but not by an impressive margin. Then he attempted something more challenging, a hard roll at cruise speed. Suddenly, the ailerons, those crucial control surfaces that governed rolling motion, stiffened dramatically. Beyond 200 knots, rolling maneuvers became labored, demanding excessive force on the control stick. He rolled left, he rolled right. The aircraft responded easily to leftward rolls, but resisted rightward turns with stubborn reluctance. This asymmetry would prove invaluable intelligence for American pilots. In the heat of a dogfight, a Zero pilot would naturally favor left rolls. An American pilot armed with this knowledge could use it against them, forcing right turns where the aircraft became sluggish and slow. The next test carried real danger. Sanders drove the Zero into a dive, then hauled back hard on the stick to create negative G-force. The engine coughed violently, sputtered, and died completely. Nothing but windrush now. He was piloting a powered glider at 3,000 feet above the California coastline. Sanders kept his composure steady, eased the stick forward, and the engine roared back to life. He ran the test twice more. Each time, identical results. The Zero's float-type carburetor, which depended on gravity to feed fuel, couldn't handle negative G-forces. The moment acceleration inverted, fuel stopped flowing to the engine entirely. This was the crucial answer American pilots desperately needed. When a Zero was chasing you, don't turn. Don't attempt to outmaneuver it in a traditional dogfight. Instead, push the stick hard forward, diving hard with negative G-force. An American aircraft with its pressure-type carburetor would keep running. The Zero's engine would quit dead. During those precious seconds of silence, an American pilot gained precious distance and the opportunity to escape. Between September 20th and October 15th, Sanders completed 24 separate test flights. Each one revealed new details about the Zero's character. The aircraft's legendary maneuverability was absolutely genuine, but it came saddled with critical limitations. Below 200 miles per hour, it could turn tighter than any Allied fighter in existence. But speed it up above 250 miles per hour, and it became stiff, sluggish, losing the nimbleness that made it dangerous. American fighters, heavier and more powerfully engineered, gained ground as speeds climbed. The accumulated test data eventually made its way into technical reports that circulated to every fighter squadron operating in the Pacific. Pilots read that intelligence with the hunger of men who had experienced nightmares made flesh. The reports confirmed suspicions that some combat veterans had already begun forming. The Zero could be beaten. not by fighting its fight, but by imposing a completely different kind of combat. Commander John Thatch had actually developed his now famous weave maneuver before the Akutan Zero even arrived. He first employed it in combat at Midway on June 4, 1942, the same day Koga crashed. Based on available intelligence about Zero capabilities, Thatch created a defensive tactic where two Wildcats flying side by side would weave toward each other when attacked, drawing pursuing Zeros into crossfire where both American pilots could shoot. The captured Zero validated and expanded his tactical theories, providing hard numbers about the Zero's specific limitations that made American tactics even deadlier. American pilots discovered how to fight Zeros using boom and zoom. Gain altitude, dive at high speed, make one firing pass, continue diving past the target, use superior speed to zoom back to altitude, then repeat. Never get slow. Never attempt to turn with a Zero. Rely on American advantages in diving speed, structural strength, and pilot protection. The captured Zero was flown against every American fighter in inventory. Mock dogfights matched it against Wildcats, P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks. Each engagement was filmed and scrutinized frame by frame. Pilots learned directly how to exploit the Zero's weaknesses, those frozen ailerons at high speed, the engine cutting out under negative G, the inability to dive as fast as heavier American machines. But the most important realization was deeper and more psychological. The Zero wasn't invincible. It was an excellent aircraft, brilliantly designed for specific purposes. But it possessed genuine vulnerabilities. It could be defeated. American pilots who had felt outgunned and desperate suddenly held answers. They had tactics. They had hope. Sanders recorded his findings carefully. His official report noted that these flights covered performance tests identical to those conducted on Navy aircraft during standard evaluation. The first flight alone exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Zero, which pilots could leverage through proper tactics. Most immediately apparent was how those ailerons froze above 200 knots, making rolling maneuvers slow and demanding excessive stick force. The knowledge rippled through the fleet like electricity. Fighter squadrons altered their training regimens. Pilots learning boom and zoom tactics before they ever encountered a Zero in combat. Veteran pilots shared the intelligence with profound relief and justified vindication. Their early losses hadn't been meaningless. They had purchased time for this knowledge to reach them. Marine pilot Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh, credited with 21 confirmed kills and decorated with the Medal of Honor, later reflected that knowing what to do when a Zero was on his tail, information drawn directly from Koga's aircraft, saved his life repeatedly. That tactical knowledge allowed him to survive encounters that should have been fatal. Navy pilot William Leonard, who would eventually retire as a rear admiral with 6 confirmed victories, described the captured Zero as a treasure, stating that to his knowledge, no other captured aircraft had ever revealed so many secrets when they were so desperately needed. Japanese military historian Masatake Okumiya, a retired lieutenant general from the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, observed that the revelations from the Akutan Zero proved as catastrophic for Japanese military fortunes as the losses at Midway itself. Yet the Akutan Zero's impact extended beyond tactical adjustments. American aircraft designers examined the wreckage with intense focus. Grumman was already developing the F-6F Hellcat as the Wildcat's replacement. The Hellcat's design had been shaped partly by combat reports from pilots fighting Zeros at Coral Sea and Midway. The first F-6F-3 made its initial flight on October 3, 1942, just weeks after Sanders started his testing. But the captured Zero provided concrete data validating specific design choices. The Hellcat that entered service in January 1943 incorporated hard-won lessons about fighting Zeros. It was faster, with a maximum speed of 380 miles per hour. Its climb rate matched or exceeded the Zeros. It retained armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, but was engineered specifically to fight Zeros on terms favorable to the American design. The Hellcat's powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than double what the Zero generated. This overwhelming power enabled boom and zoom tactics, allowing Hellcat pilots to control engagement conditions. In November 1943, the Akutan Zero was displayed at Washington National Airport as a war trophy during festivities celebrating the 25th anniversary of airmail service. Thousands of Americans viewed the aircraft that had haunted the Pacific, confronting in person the fighter that their sons and brothers faced above hostile seas. The Zero looked sinister, predatory, menacing. Few understood they were witnessing the physical embodiment of a fundamentally different design philosophy. By 1944, the aircraft had been transferred back to North Island for use as a training platform. New pilots flew combat engagements against it, learning its capabilities and limitations in realistic scenarios. Another Zero, a Model 52, captured during the Guam liberation, joined it for training. American pilots who would soon fight over the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa first battled the Akutan Zero above California skies, gaining experience and confidence before facing true combat. The philosophical divide between American and Japanese aircraft design became increasingly pronounced as the war deepened. American designers steadily enhanced fighter protection. The F-4U Corsair entering service in 1943 featured armor, self-sealing tanks, and overwhelming power from its 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. The P-38 Lightning carried twin engines and substantial armament while safeguarding its pilot. Japanese designers attempted adding protection to later Zero models. The A6M5 variant, introduced in 1943, included a 55mm armored glass windscreen and an 8mm armor plate behind the pilot. But these additions increased weight without corresponding engine upgrades. The Nakajima Sakai power plant remained limited to approximately 1,000 horsepower. Weight increased by 28%, while horsepower rose just 16%. Later, Zeros became slower, less agile, less capable than the A6M2 that Koga had flown. Japanese engineers had attempted adopting American protection philosophy but lacked the powerful engines necessary to maintain performance under the additional burden. The result was a fighter that surrendered its primary strength without gaining offsetting advantages. By 1944, American fighter pilots owned the Pacific skies. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 inflicted devastating losses on Japan. American fighters and anti-aircraft batteries shot down over 500 Japanese aircraft. American losses totaled approximately 43 aircraft in combat, plus 80 additional losses from operational accidents during night carrier landings and fuel starvation. Japanese pilots flying Zeros against veteran Americans in Hellcats and Corsairs confronted impossible odds. Japanese pilot losses became catastrophic. The experienced aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had dominated early campaigns, were being systematically destroyed in aircraft unable to protect them. Japan's pilot training system couldn't replace them fast enough. Replacement pilots arrived with minimal training, limited experience, and minimal survival prospects. The quality gap widened with each passing month. By October 1944, during operations in the Philippines, Zeros began appearing in kamikaze attacks. When aircraft could no longer compete in traditional combat, they became guided missiles. Pilots received orders to crash into American vessels. More A6M fighters were used for these suicide missions than any other aircraft type. The Zero, designed to dominate aerial combat over China, ended its operational career as expendable ordnance. The design philosophy underlying the Zero had rested on assumptions that proved catastrophically incorrect. Japanese military planners believed the war would be brief. They planned a decisive strike, quick American defeat, negotiated peace from strength. In a short conflict, pilot attrition wouldn't matter. Survival statistics would prove irrelevant. Immediate combat effectiveness was everything. They also believed their pilots possessed fundamental superiority, that rigorous training and warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantages. Both assumptions collapsed entirely. The war wasn't short. It endured 4 brutal years of relentless attrition, and American pilots, initially less experienced, learned with remarkable speed. Combat experience accumulated steadily. Tactics evolved. Training improved. By 1943, American pilots equaled Japanese pilots in capability. By 1944, with experienced Japanese pilots lost and untrained replacements entering combat, Americans held decisive superiority. The Zero's lack of protection, tolerable in a brief war, became devastating in a prolonged one. A pilot in a protected American fighter could survive being shot down once, twice, even multiple times. He would eject, be rescued, return to operations. He would extract lessons from each encounter, becoming increasingly effective with every mission. A Zero pilot shot down once faced probable death. No second opportunity. No learning progression. No accumulated experience. Every Zero destroyed meant one experienced pilot lost permanently. On a foggy July morning in 1942, the American pilot Albert Nax spotted something through the mist that would change everything. Red circles painted on the fuselage. A Japanese fighter, intact, abandoned on an Alaskan marsh. The aircraft they would come to know as the Akutan Zero had just handed its secrets to the enemy. The specifications the Japanese military demanded for their new fighter were staggering. The aircraft needed to reach speeds of 310 miles per hour at an altitude of 13,120 feet. It had to climb to 9,840 feet in just 3 minutes and 30 seconds. The armament requirements called for two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. Full radio capability, a direction finder, and perhaps most critically, sufficient fuel range to escort bombing runs across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Meeting such demands with the engine technology available at the time seemed almost impossible. The engineers at Nakajima Aircraft Company looked at the specifications and made a decision. It could not be done. They withdrew from the competition entirely. Only Mitsubishi stepped forward to accept the challenge. Jiro Horikoshi, their chief designer, took on the task that others had rejected. Years later, Horikoshi would reflect on his approach. The immediate goal, he wrote, was to win the contract. Performance mattered more than philosophical debate about the future of fighter aircraft. His solution was radical in its simplicity. Build the aircraft as light as humanly possible. Every component that was not absolutely essential to meeting the specifications had to go. Armor plating, not mentioned in the requirements. Self-sealing fuel tanks, not listed. Strip them out. The weight saved could be devoted to fuel instead, achieving the required range. The lightweight construction would enable the maneuverability the specifications demanded. It was elegant thinking, but it reflected a dangerous philosophy. The Japanese military valued offensive power above all else. Attack was everything. In their worldview, a warrior accepted risk as an inevitable part of combat. Protection was secondary to effectiveness. A pilot's survival mattered less than the aircraft's ability to destroy the enemy. When the captured Akutan Zero fell into American hands, it exposed this fundamental divide to careful study. The U.S. Navy's technical reports were revealing. The Zero had been designed almost exclusively for the attack role. It emphasized long range, extraordinary maneuverability, and powerful armament at the direct expense of protecting the pilot. American designers had reached different conclusions entirely. They believed protection was not weakness. They understood that survival was not cowardice. A pilot who returned to base and flew again tomorrow was worth more than a pilot who achieved perfection in a single engagement before dying. The industrial implications ran even deeper. An armored fighter cost more to build. It consumed more materials. It took longer to manufacture on the assembly line, but it survived longer in actual combat. More importantly, its pilots survived longer. Japan could manufacture aircraft faster than it could train replacement pilots to fly them. America had inverted that equation. American factories could train new pilots faster than Japanese factories could build replacement aircraft. The mathematics of industrial warfare favored the side that protected its people. After the war, American technical intelligence teams interviewed captured Japanese aircraft designers. The testimony confirmed what the Akutan Zero had already revealed. The absence of armor and self-sealing tanks was not an oversight. It was deliberate. It stemmed from specific tactical requirements and an operational philosophy rooted in Japanese military doctrine. Horikoshi himself stated in his post-war memoir that armor protection had never appeared in the initial design specifications. The weight restrictions had forced choices. Armament, range, and maneuverability had to be prioritized. Japanese military thinking assigned low value to protective features. They were viewed as luxuries, not necessities. Only after the wholesale slaughter of experienced pilots did Japanese strategists finally recognize that living to fight another day held more value in modern warfare than achieving maximum performance in a single combat encounter. The American test pilots who flew the captured Zero could not hide their respect for Japanese engineering skill. They could also not hide their shock at the aircraft's fundamental vulnerability. Edward Sanders, one of the most experienced test pilots in the Navy, flew the Akutan Zero and marveled at what he found. The aircraft was the finest he had ever flown at low speed. Its maneuverability was extraordinary. The handling was delightful. But he would never, he said, want to take it into combat. One bullet could kill you. The aircraft offered no protection, no second chance. Captain Eric Brown, the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, piloted the captured Zero and called it the most maneuverable fighter he had ever flown. He could turn inside any Allied aircraft he had encountered. But he could not escape one inescapable reality. There was no armor. There were no protected fuel tanks. It was a death trap for modern combat. Beautiful to fly, he said, terrible to fight in. The fate of Tadayoshi Koga embodied the Zero's philosophical flaw. Koga was 19 years old, an experienced and skilled aviator who had flown multiple combat missions and survived them. A single bullet pierced an oil line. That was all it took. He was dead. If his aircraft had been designed with survival in mind, if critical systems had been protected and redundant, he might have nursed the crippled fighter back to his carrier. He might have flown again. His experience and skill might have been preserved for future battles. Instead, he fell in an Alaskan marsh, his sacrifice inadvertently serving the enemy. His Zero became the schoolroom where American engineers learned to defeat him. The secrets he never intended to reveal were extracted from the wreckage by a foreign power. His death changed the course of the war in ways he could never have foreseen. The Akutan Zero itself met an ignominious end in February 1945. While being ferried from San Diego, a Curtiss SB-2C crashed into it during ground operations at North Island. The aircraft was destroyed beyond recovery. It was scrapped shortly after, its work complete. But the intelligence it provided lived on in the tactics and strategies American pilots developed. Thousands of American pilots owed their lives to the lessons learned from that captured machine. The Hellcat design reflected knowledge gained from studying the Zero in minute detail. The boom and zoom tactics, the understanding of the Zero's limitations at high speed, the knowledge of how to exploit its carburetor weakness, all emerged from test flights of the Akutan Zero. They all stemmed from what American engineers learned from taking it apart and putting it back together. The parallel evolution of American and Japanese fighters told a larger story about industrial capacity and strategic priorities. American aircraft grew progressively more protected, more powerful, more capable with each new variant. The F-6F Hellcat gave way to the F-80F Bearcat, even more powerful and more heavily armored. Japanese aircraft desperately tried to add protection, but the industrial capacity simply did not exist. The gap widened year by year until Japanese fighters were obsolete by the standards of 1944. The ultimate lesson transcended mere technical concerns. Aircraft design reflects cultural values and strategic assumptions. The Zero embodied Japanese values of offensive capability, acceptance of personal risk, and belief in swift, decisive war. American fighters reflected a completely different set of values. They embodied pilot protection, preparation for long-term attrition warfare, and industrial sustainability. When two industrial powers clash in a prolonged war of attrition, the philosophy that prioritizes pilot protection prevails. This was not a matter of bravery or skill. It was mathematics. American pilots were more likely to survive their encounters. Survival brought experience. Experience brought effectiveness. The cycle compounded relentlessly until American air superiority became absolute. The Zero's lack of protection, initially an acceptable trade for performance, became the fatal flaw that destroyed Japanese air power. Modern historians examining the Pacific Air War inevitably return to the Akutan Zero as a pivotal moment. The captured aircraft did not directly change fighters already in production. It did not reshape the Hellcat's design, which was already well along in development, but it fundamentally changed American understanding of the enemy. It revealed specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited. It provided hope when hope was desperately needed. By July 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, America was losing in the Pacific. American forces retreated across the ocean. The Zero dominated every sky where Americans flew. The Akutan Zero arrived at the precise moment when American morale needed restoration, when tactical innovation meant survival, when understanding the enemy was critical. When Lieutenant Commander Sanders's initial test flight report circulated through Naval Aviation Commands, it moved like electricity through pilots' hands. They read and reread the section describing one specific phenomenon. The Zero's engine would cut out under negative G-forces. Finally, they understood. Finally, they had discovered an escape. Push the stick forward, dive sharply with negative G. The Zero's engine would quit. An American engine would keep running. You would live. That single tactical discovery saved hundreds of lives. Marine pilots fighting at Guadalcanal, Navy pilots at Santa Cruz, Army pilots in New Guinea. All of them applied the lesson. They survived encounters that should have killed them. They returned to base to fight another day. Their experience accumulated, their skills sharpened. Gradually, imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. The captured Zero also reverberated through Japanese strategy. When intelligence officers learned that an intact Zero had been recovered and taken by the Americans, consternation spread through military circles. They understood the implications immediately. Their primary fighter's secrets were exposed. American pilots would learn how to defeat it. The psychological advantage of the seemingly invincible Zero would evaporate. Japanese strategists began planning replacement fighters, but development consumed years and demanded resources Japan simply did not possess. The Zero would remain in service, growing increasingly obsolete with every passing month, while replacements remained distant promises. Those replacements, when they finally arrived, would be too few and far too late. The Zero's capture accelerated Japanese defeat by exposing vulnerabilities that combat attrition alone would have taken years longer to reveal. The most startling discovery about the Zero was not what it could do, it was what it could not do. American expectations had been shaped by propaganda and by fear. They anticipated a superweapon, an invincible aircraft built by a mysterious enemy with unknowable capabilities. They discovered a brilliantly engineered machine with fatal design flaws. No armor meant death from relatively minor damage. No self-sealing tanks meant fire and explosion from small-caliber rounds. The float-type carburetor meant engine failure under negative G, the very maneuver pilots would instinctively perform to escape. Ailerons that froze at high speed meant the aircraft could not roll effectively in high-speed combat. Each weakness was the direct price extracted for the Zero's strengths. Maneuverability demanded the sacrifice of protection. Range demanded the sacrifice of robustness. Lightweight construction demanded sacrifices in durability. American designers had made fundamentally different choices. They had different priorities and access to greater industrial resources. Pilot survival stood paramount. Aircraft could be replaced. Trained pilots could not. Therefore, protection justified its weight penalty. Armor was acceptable if it brought pilots home. Self-sealing tanks were mandatory even if they reduced fuel capacity. Rugged construction was required despite any reduction in performance. These choices reflected American industrial capacity and cultural values. America could build more aircraft and train more pilots. They could afford to make aircraft heavy and expensive if that heaviness kept pilots alive. Japan could not adopt this approach. Limited industrial capacity meant aircraft had to remain simple, lightweight, and quick to manufacture. But this approach, however rational in the short term, proved catastrophic long term. The Akutan Zero became far more than a wartime tale. It emerged as a case study in design philosophy, cultural values, and strategic thinking. Every aircraft embodies the assumptions and priorities of its designers. The Zero embodied Japanese assumptions about war, combat, and conflict itself. American fighters embodied utterly different assumptions about industrial capacity. the value of pilots, and long-term strategy. These competing philosophies clashed across Pacific skies for 4 years. Gradually, inevitably, the philosophy valuing pilot survival prevailed over the philosophy accepting pilot sacrifice as the price of performance. The Zero, magnificent in 1941, was obsolete by 1943 and suicidal by 1944. Not because Japanese engineering was inferior, but because Japanese strategy was unsustainable. Today, the legacy of the Akutan Zero persists in aviation museums, in history books, in tactical manuals. It remains the most significant captured aircraft of World War II, the intelligence breakthrough that helped turn the tide in the Pacific. Tadayoshi Koga's unintentional sacrifice saved thousands of American lives and shortened the war by months, perhaps years. The Zero itself stands as a symbol of the Pacific War's tragedy. A beautiful aircraft, perfectly executed to meet its specifications, fundamentally flawed by the assumptions underlying those specifications. Japanese pilots loved flying it. American pilots learned to defeat it. Both sides recognized it as a masterpiece of lightweight design and a cautionary tale of valuing performance over protection. The deepest lesson was remarkably simple. In warfare, as in life, choices have consequences. Choose speed over protection, and you pay in lives lost. Choose maneuverability over robustness, and you pay in aircraft destroyed. Choose short-term performance over long-term sustainability, and you pay in strategic defeat. The Zero made these choices deliberately, brilliantly, fatally. And on that foggy July morning, when Albert Nax spotted those red circles through the mist, those choices were revealed to American engineers. They studied it, understood it, exploited it. The abandoned Zero in an Alaskan marsh became the instructor that taught not merely how to defeat one aircraft type, but how to win the entire air war. That discovery, more than any single battle, helped ensure American victory in the Pacific.